fastest aging society in human history. The second big number is that China's population peaked last year, in fact, with the population dropping by about 800,000 people. The scary thing about both of these figures is that we know they're wrong. A couple years ago, the Chinese started releasing bits and pieces out of their 2020 decade census, and they came to the grudging and public admission that they had overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, with all of those missing millions having been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago. So we're talking about exclusively these 100 million people or so are people who would have been aged 40 or under, the folks who have the kids. You combine that with the birth rate information, and we are looking at the complete dissolution of the Chinese demography in a very short period of time. Because if you're losing a lot of people, or you've never had a lot of people under age 40, that suggests that the ability of the Chinese system to maintain a workforce and a tax base is dissolving before our eyes. And we've never seen a system any time in history that's been able to make it through this sort of transition without a massive, massive, massive change in the political and economic environment. And the possible changes the Chinese are about to experience are not what I would consider things that will make this work better. The problem is that the Chinese model, economic model, is completely dependent upon globalization and internationalization. This is a country that imports 75 to 80% of their oil. This is the world's largest importer of food. This is a country whose oil comes primarily from the Persian Gulf, which is no longer being patrolled by anyone with a navy. And this is a country whose economic model is utterly dependent upon the ability to import raw materials and tech and then export semi-finished and finished goods to other markets that are in a different hemisphere for the most part, or at least a different continent. None of this works unless everyone gets along, and China has seen its economic and political relations with every single trading partner bottom out, with the exception, of course, with the Russians, because there's a shared love of genocide there. So a couple things. First, to a degree, we've always known that this was coming. In addition to the one-child policy, the Chinese have been the fastest urbanizing country in human history. And when you move off the farm and into the city, kids become a bit of a luxury good as opposed to free labor, so everyone has fewer of them. And the fact that urbanization happened at the same time as the one-child policy just crunched down the birth rate even more. We've now seen the birth rate officially, by the numbers that are probably over-optimistic, fall by more than 60% in just the last 6 years. And this is to a degree expected, because when the birth rate is low for long enough, eventually, 30, 40 years on, it cuts into the number of people who are having the children in the first place. So if you have a smaller generation with a much lower birth rate, you get a catastrophically lower birth rate, and that's exactly where we are right now, and this will not get better unless we figure out human cloning at scale. Second is the issue of timing. At the rate of degradation, there will have never been a country we already have never had a country in human history in this sort of situation, but we don't even have an economic theory for how an economy might function if this Chinese data continues on its current path for just another 8 years. So 2030 is probably the use-by date if it doesn't break sooner. And that assumes nothing else goes wrong in the Chinese system. Nothing with agriculture, nothing with trade, nothing with finance, nothing with the Americans, nothing with energy. Orthodox Christian world, which is a huge swath of territory stretching from Russia to Belarus and Ukraine and Moldova, Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia. Now, these countries have three characteristics in common that have really shaped their demographic destinies, and none of them have been great. The first is broad-scale economic dislocation. These were the parts of the former communist world that didn't do well even at the height of communism. They weren't very advanced, and especially when the post-Cold War system erupted, they didn't have anything really to contribute aside from raw commodities. Their industry was outdated. They weren't producing steel like the Czech Republic or IT stuff like the Latvians. They were only doing grains and raw materials and energy. And you can get growth from that. You can get wealth from that. You can get infrastructure and development from that. But unless it is really, really well managed, the population just doesn't see a whole lot of it. So these countries were in and out of horrible recessions for really 30 years. It's a less bad in places like Romania and Bulgaria, because they did ultimately get into the EU in the late 2000s, but they were the last ones in line. Serbia took kind of a double hit because they don't have a lot of raw materials that they can export to the world. And in the aftermath of the NATO bombings in the Yugoslav wars in the early 1990s, Serbia never moved on. So even with the Russians under Putin going from win to win in terms of global policy and generating a lot of income from oil, in Serbia there was a whole lot of nothing. And politics basically became locked down in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars, and the country really was never able to advance to whatever is next, and that holds true even today. Okay, what's second? Because of the economic dislocation, because so many people didn't see a lot of opportunity, you had huge immigration from all of these states, mostly to Western Europe, some to the United States and Canada. In the cases of Romania and Bulgaria, once they got into the EU, if anything, the outmigration accelerated because there were then fewer restrictions. The Russians easily lost 10 million people in the 1990s and early 2000s to the wider world. And in the case of Moldova, perhaps as much as 1/4 of the female population under age 50 left, never to return. A lot of them going into the sex trade because there really wasn't a lot of an option, because education in Moldova during the Soviet periods was even very low. Serbia is probably the country that has suffered the most from this outmigration because, again, the government just has never moved on and there's never been a plan economically for what's next. The third one kind of flies under the radar and is probably going to piss a few people off, but here we are. Birth control in this region, the primary method is abortion. So on average, more than 7 out of 10 pregnancies across this space are terminated. And if you have one abortion, I know I'm a dude, I really have no right to say this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that it's not critical to your health. But if you have 10, you're probably endangering your future fertility. So between a very low death rate, a very high abortion rate, and very high infertility rates because of the weird intersection of healthcare and birth control and economic collapse, it's arguable that a lot of these countries, probably Russia right at the very top of that list, simply could not repopulate even if the economic conditions were to turn around. So this is the part of the world that is duking it out with Northeast Asia for the lowest birth rates and the fastest national mortality, if that's the right term, in the world. So that's kind of the overview. Those are the 3 big issues that shape the region as a whole. But we do need to give additional attention to the Russians and the Ukrainians. Now, the Russians have had a series of stacked geopolitical disasters. World War I, World War II, Stalin's famines, Brezhnev's mismanagement, Khrushchev's mismanagement, and then the post-Cold War collapse. All these kind of stacked on each other, and so that the current generation that is now in their 20s is the smallest one they've ever had. The Russians say they've got a metric butt ton